Whether you just started investing or not, exchange-traded funds, known as ETFs, offer one of the simplest yet best ways that nearly anyone can use to invest in the stock market and build wealth over time, where their growth over the past few years has been trending upward at an incredible rate. Now, if you don't know what ETFs are, they're pretty much a way for you to invest and own hundreds to thousands of different investments all within one purchase. And so with all the investing content that I create on my own channel and even more with my new startup InvestLane, I thought, what if I could only pick 3 ETFs? But before we get started, my name is Sully, and all I ask is if you do find value in this video, that you consider hitting the like and subscribe button for future content like this. So to get straight to it, the first one on my list is my personal favorite right now, and that is the Schwab US Large Cap Growth ETF with the ticker of SCHG. And so the first thing to realize is that each of the 3 ETFs that I'm about to show you, they track a particular stock market index, where you can see on the main page for SCHG that the fund's goal is to track as closely as possible, before fees and expenses, the total return of the Dow Jones US Large Cap Growth Total Stock Market Index. And so if we look at the S&P Dow Jones Indices fact sheet, you can see that this index is designed to measure the performance of large cap US equity securities that are classified as growth based on a multi-factor analysis. But the key thing to realize here is that when you buy SCHG, in literally the click of a button, you can get instant exposure to 197 companies, where looking back at the index, you can see that it states it is a market cap weighted index. So each of the funds that I'm about to show you in this video are considered market cap weighted, and do know that all that means is that the top companies in each of the funds are going to be given weight based on their size. So when we look at SCHG's top 10 holdings, you've probably heard of most, if not all of them, where the top 3 alone include Nvidia, Apple, then Microsoft, where they each make up roughly 8 to 10% of the entire fund. And largely because of that, if we look at the top sectors that make up the fund, you can see that the information technology sector is by far the largest, covering almost half of the entire fund, with communication services and then consumer discretionary thereafter. Now, one point I have to add is that SCHG is just one of a few solid growth ETFs, where you may have also heard of the Invesco QQQ or Vanguard's VUG that I've also made a lot of content on, and they're all very similar. So I'll have other videos and resources that I've created linked in the description below for you to check out after this video. But I say that because QQQ is the 5th largest ETF in the world, with $407 billion in assets under its management, where we then have VUG after that at $203 billion. But do note that SCHG is not as popular, where its total assets under management is currently $52 billion. So the choice of the 3 really comes down to what you prefer and believe in most. But what I really like about SCHG is that if we look at its historical performance, and yes, the past doesn't guarantee the future, and we've also had a very strong market, but over the past 10 years, SCHG has averaged 17.94% in growth per year, which means a $100,000 investment 10 years ago, that was in 2015, by today, that would now be over $500,000. Or let's say that you instead started with $10,000 and you invest $500 every month throughout that time, you would now have over $200,000. And the neat thing here is that to gain exposure to such a strong performing investment, all it's going to cost you is 0.04% of a fee per year, which is also referred to as the expense ratio, and all that means is that for every $10,000 that you invest, you would pay $4 per year in fees. And do know that the fees are automatically taken out over time. It's not something that you have to pay separately. Which I will say, another thing that many overlook is that depending on where you hold the investments, the dividends you earn can lead to what's called tax drag, because whether you reinvest dividends or not, they will trigger taxes to you in a regular taxable account. And so with SCHG, it also has a super low dividend yield of 0.35% over the trailing 12 months. And based on 2024's qualified dividend income summary from Charles Schwab, SCHG has pretty much distributed nearly 100% qualified dividends. So knowing that, realize that if you want SCHG or to consider VUG or QQQ, and also be aware that if you are simply looking to invest for the long term, that you can also save on fees by investing into QQQM. But regardless of which you choose, you are at least exposed to many growth-oriented companies, and is why there's significantly less risk there than going all in on only a handful of stocks. Now we'll cover a few portfolio examples later in the video and how they would have done historically, but let's now move on to discuss my number 2 ETF, that is the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF with the ticker of VTI. Now VTI seeks to track the CRSP US Total Market Index, which means it provides exposure across large, mid, and small cap US equities diversified across growth and value styles. The difference here is that this investment is much more broad because it covers the majority of publicly traded US companies, where you can see it has 3,531 stocks that you can get exposure to all within one purchase. And because this is a very strong overall investment and is coming from Vanguard, who makes up a large amount of the entire ETF industry, VTI is currently listed as the 4th largest ETF in the world based on its assets under management. Now, because VTI is primarily weighted toward the large cap S&P 500 companies, realize that the top 10 here are also very similar to some of SCHG's top holdings, where Nvidia, Apple, and Microsoft are still the top 3 holdings, but now they make up less weight, being each around 6 to 7%. And also realize that 40% of this fund alone is currently exposed to the technology sector. On top of that, VTI also has a super low cost of 0.03%. It has a dividend yield of 1.11% over the trailing 12 months, with a qualified dividend income percentage of just over 90%. And historically, the fund has also averaged 14.01% over the past 10 years, and since 2001, when the fund publicly launched, that number is 9.25%. All right, knowing that about VTI, let's go over the last ETF that I would choose, and that is the Vanguard FTSE Developed Markets ETF, with the ticker of VEA. Now, VEA seeks to track the performance of the FTSE Developed All Cap, excluding the US, where you can see it provides a convenient way to match the performance of stocks of large, mid, and small cap companies located in Canada and the major markets of Europe and the Pacific region. And so currently the fund has 3,866 stocks. It is the 7th largest ETF in the world by having over $187 billion in assets under its management. And if we look at the top 10 holdings, the fund is much more diversified because there are only 2 stocks that carry more than 1% of the entire weight toward the fund. You can also see that Europe makes up the majority of this fund, having over 50% of the weight, then the Pacific, and North America, as they mentioned, Canada. Now, another nice point to mention about this fund is that it has a 0.03% expense ratio, and while it hasn't achieved the long-term success like investing into the US stock market, it has still seen fair returns, where over the past 10 years, it has averaged 8.18% per year, and so far for the year of 2025, it is up over 31% and has outperformed the US stock market even better than the growth fund SCHG that has returned 18.5%. Now, do know that there is one very popular alternative that you could choose here, and that is the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF with the ticker of VXUS. And the main differences here are that you can now get exposed to over 8,000 stocks, and the biggest addition to that comes from emerging markets, but the fund has a slightly higher expense ratio and the tax efficiency is slightly worse. For example, with VEA, it has generated a 2.71% dividend yield over the past 12 months, where VXUS has also done the same, but if we look at the qualified dividend income percentage, VXUS for 2024 was noted to be about 61%, where when we look at VEA, that was about 72%. And I will mention that VXUS has also historically achieved slightly lower returns over time as well, where you can see over the past 10 years, it has averaged 8.04%, and year to date is 29.11%. In the end, if you want international exposure, these two are among the top options to consider, and VXUS would be ideal if you want exposure to emerging markets, and then VEA if you want a slightly lower expense, slightly more tax efficiency, and a potentially higher return over time. But knowing that, let's now go over a few 3-fund portfolio examples. Now, the first example I'll mention here is a simple, moderate portfolio of having 1/3 go to each fund, and I'm not saying to do this, but I'm just using it as a simple example because of how it's done over time. And if we look at the past 10 years with this portfolio, an initial $10,000 would have turned into $36,000, where it would have averaged 14% per year, with the worst year being down 22% and the best being up 31%. To understand how this compares to the S&P 500, that is considered the US stock market benchmark, this portfolio would have underperformed the market because the S&P 500 averaged 14.79% per year. But if we now get a bit more growth oriented and now say 40% goes toward each SCHG and VTI, and then 20% into international, then this portfolio would have turned $10,000 into $40,000 and would have averaged 15.02% per year, which would have slightly outperformed the S&P 500. But something I would personally do because of my age and situation, especially if you are one in a taxable account and are able to take on the risk and the volatility for more growth, I would increase the weighting to SCHG to be the foundation and let's say 60%, 30% for VTI, and then 10% for international, then that would have turned $10,000 into $45,000, and it would have averaged 16.37% per year, which would have outbeat the S&P 500 by a good amount. In the end, as long as you gain diversification across the market and the money you invest you don't need to touch for quite some time, the broad market has proven to do very well for long-term investors, and is why index funds are crucial to understand because they can help nearly anyone succeed in the market without having to take on too much risk. This alone has been a huge reason for why I just recently started InvestLane, because our mission is to help others save and invest wisely to build lasting wealth. And remember, please do whatever you believe is best for your situation. This is not financial advice, and you must do your own research. Now, if you want to start investing on your own, I'll have direct links to our review on the top brokerage accounts as well as high yield savings accounts so that you can earn more interest on your cash. End of the day, I want you to do what's best for your finances, but do know that depending on the accounts you get started with, I may earn a commission for it, which is greatly appreciated. And as always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and notifications button for future content like this.